A poor mechanic saved her from a car wreck. Unaware she's a millionaire looking for a husband, he risked everything to pull her from the wreckage, never expecting the stranger in his arms was hiding a secret that could change both their lives. Drawn to his kindness, she lies about who she is, but the closer they get, the harder it becomes to keep the truth buried. When a powerful enemy exposes her identity in front of the whole town, betrayal cuts deeper than any crash. Was their love ever real, or just another deception? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. Lillian Porter stared at her untouched creme brulee, her appetite long gone. Across the table, Trevor Whitfield, heir to the Whitfield banking fortune and her date for the evening, hadn't stopped talking about himself for the past hour. His current topic, how he'd recently expanded his investment portfolio with a brilliant acquisition that would revolutionize the market. "Of course," he said, leaning forward with a practiced smile. "With the Porter real estate connections, we could really make something spectacular happen together." There it was, the inevitable pivot to her family's wealth and influence. Lillian had heard variations of this speech on nearly every date for the past year. "Fascinating," she murmured, glancing at her watch. "I should really be going." Trevor's smile faltered. "But we haven't even discussed the charity gala next month. I thought perhaps we could attend together." The perfect networking opportunity for him, no doubt. Lillian signaled for the check. "I'm afraid I have early meetings tomorrow." A lie, but a necessary one. 20 minutes later, Lillian sat behind the wheel of her silver Mercedes, rain beginning to tap against the windshield. She should go home to her empty penthouse, but the thought made her chest tighten. On impulse, she turned away from the city center and headed toward the highway. The lake house. Her family's secluded retreat 2 hours north would give her the space to breathe, to think. Her brother Harrison had texted earlier about a storm warning, but she'd grown up navigating these roads. Besides, the storm wouldn't hit full force until morning. As the city lights faded behind her, Lillian loosened her grip on the steering wheel. The rain intensified, drumming against the roof in a steady rhythm that matched her heartbeat. Out here, she wasn't Lillian Porter, heiress and business executive. She was just Lillian. "What are you doing with your life?" she asked her reflection in the rearview mirror. 32 years old, and what did she have to show for it? A string of relationships with men who saw her as a business opportunity, rather than a person. The windshield wipers worked furiously as the storm gathered strength, sweeping across the road in sheets. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the dense forest on either side of the narrow highway. Perhaps Harrison had been right about the weather. Lillian slowed the car, peering through the downpour. The road curved sharply ahead, following the contour of a steep ravine. She'd driven this route countless times, but never in conditions this treacherous. Her phone chimed with an incoming call. Harrison again, probably checking on her whereabouts. She glanced down for just a second. That's when it happened. The Mercedes hit a pool of standing water at the curve. Lillian felt the sickening sensation of hydroplaning, the steering wheel suddenly useless in her hands. She slammed on the brakes, but the car continued its trajectory, spinning toward the guardrail. Metal screamed against metal. The guardrail gave way. For one suspended moment, Lillian felt weightless, her breath caught in her throat. Then gravity took hold. The car plummeted down the ravine, rolling once, twice before coming to rest upside down in the rising creek below. Pain exploded through Lillian's body as the airbag deployed. Water began seeping through the door seams, cold and insistent. "Help," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. She fumbled with her seatbelt, her fingers slick with blood from a cut on her forehead. The belt wouldn't release. Panic surged through her as water rose past her shoulders. Her last thought before consciousness slipped away was how ironic it was. She'd spent years protecting herself from emotional drowning, only to face the real thing alone. Damon Reeves wiped grease from his hands as he prepared to close his garage for the night. The ancient radio on his workbench crackled with static as the weather report warned of flash flooding. He'd have to check the roof again. The last storm had sprung 3 new leaks over his precision equipment. He flipped through a stack of bills on the counter, calculating how many repair jobs he'd need to keep the lights on another month. Not for the first time, he wondered if he should have sold the place after his grandfather passed, instead of pouring his savings into specialized safety systems that traditional customers rarely appreciated. The crash came without warning, a distant sound of impact, followed by the unmistakable screech of metal giving way. Damon's head snapped up, his body tensing as he listened. Years of roadside assistance had trained him to recognize that sound. Without hesitation, he grabbed his emergency kit and flashlight from behind the counter. He shrugged into his rain jacket as he burst through the door, the wind nearly knocking him sideways. The rain stung his face as he ran toward the highway, guided by instinct more than sight. At the curve, his flashlight beam caught the broken guardrail. Damon's stomach dropped as he leaned over the edge, spotting the luxury car overturned in the rising creek below. "Hey!" he shouted. "Anyone down there?" Only the storm answered. The ravine was steep, the ground treacherous with mud, but Damon didn't hesitate. He began his descent, one thought driving him forward. Someone needed help, and he was the only one around to give it. Damon scrambled down the muddy embankment, his boots slipping on the saturated ground. The rain pounded mercilessly against his back as he half slid, half ran toward the overturned vehicle. Water from the creek, normally a gentle trickle, had swollen into an angry torrent that now reached the car's wheels. "Hold on!" he shouted, though he doubted anyone could hear him over the storm. The luxury car lay upside down, its sleek design now a death trap as water poured in through the shattered windows. Damon waded into the knee-deep current, fighting against the pull that threatened to sweep his feet from under him. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the interior. That's when he saw her, a woman, hanging upside down from her seatbelt, unmoving. Blood trickled from a gash on her forehead, mixing with the rising water that had already reached her shoulders. "Damn it," Damon muttered, his heart pounding. He tried the door handle, but it was jammed. The water level rose with terrifying speed, now touching the woman's chin. There wasn't time for niceties. Damon grabbed the hammer from his emergency kit and smashed the driver's side window, careful to aim away from the unconscious woman. Glass shattered, adding to the cacophony of the storm. He reached through the opening, cutting his arm on a jagged edge, but barely registering the pain. "I've got you," he said, supporting her head with one hand, while reaching for the seatbelt release with the other. The mechanism was submerged now, requiring him to feel blindly beneath the murky water. The car shifted ominously, the current pushing against its frame. Damon worked faster, his fingers finally finding the buckle. He pressed hard, and the belt gave way. The woman collapsed into his arms, a dead weight that nearly sent them both underwater. With strength born of desperation, Damon pulled her through the window opening. Her designer clothes snagged on the broken glass, but he kept moving, aware that every second counted. Just as he lifted her clear of the wreckage, the creek surged. The car groaned once, then was swept away in the flash flood, disappearing into the darkness downstream. Damon stood frozen for a moment, the woman cradled against his chest, water swirling around his thighs. If he'd arrived even a minute later. He shook off the thought and began the arduous climb back up the ravine. The woman remained unconscious, her skin pale in the beam of his flashlight. She was breathing, but each inhalation sounded labored and wet. "Stay with me," he urged, his boots finding purchase in the mud as he ascended. Rain pelted them both, washing away the blood from her forehead wound, revealing a face that, even in unconsciousness, carried an unmistakable elegance. When he finally reached the road, Damon laid her gently on a relatively flat patch of ground and pulled out his phone. The screen lit up, 1 bar of service, enough to call 911. He reported the accident, his voice steady despite his racing pulse. Female, early 30s, unconscious, possible head injury, and water in lungs. Yes, I pulled her from the vehicle. No, I don't know her name. While waiting for the ambulance, Damon performed basic first aid, checking her airway and placing his rain jacket over her to preserve body heat. He gently turned her onto her side, allowing water to drain from her mouth. After a few moments, she coughed weakly but didn't regain consciousness. The ambulance arrived 20 minutes later, its lights cutting through the storm like a beacon. The paramedics worked efficiently, stabilizing the woman's neck, checking her vitals, and loading her onto a stretcher. "You saved her life," one of them told Damon as they prepared to depart. "Another few minutes in that water." Damon nodded, watching as they loaded her into the ambulance. Without giving it much thought, he jumped into his truck and followed the flashing lights all the way to Lakeside Community Hospital. Later, the emergency room was quiet at this hour. Damon paced the waiting area, leaving muddy footprints on the linoleum floor. His clothes were soaked through, his cut arm now throbbing with each heartbeat. A nurse had bandaged it for him, but he'd refused further treatment, more concerned about the woman he'd pulled from the wreckage. As he waited, Damon's thoughts drifted to his garage. The mortgage payment was due in 3 days, and he was short again. All that specialized safety equipment he'd invested in, crash prevention systems, advanced diagnostic tools for autonomous driving features, sat gathering dust. Local customers didn't understand why they should pay premium prices for what they saw as unnecessary frills. He'd believed so strongly in making vehicles safer, had poured his inheritance and his heart into the venture. Now he faced foreclosure while the innovations that could save lives like the woman's tonight remained unused. "Excuse me," a doctor approached, clipboard in hand. "You're the man who rescued the accident victim?" Damon straightened, pushing thoughts of financial ruin aside. "Yes. How is she?" "Stable. She's lucky you found her." After a few hours, the fluorescent lights of the hospital room buzzed softly as Lillian's eyelids fluttered open. Her head throbbed with each heartbeat, and her throat felt raw, as though she'd swallowed sandpaper. Confusion washed over her as she tried to piece together where she was and why. The antiseptic smell and beeping monitors answered the first question, hospital. But the second remained a mystery until fragments of memory returned. Rain, water rising, panic, and then darkness. She attempted to sit up but winced at the sharp pain in her ribs. A movement near the door caught her attention. A man rose from a chair, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the hallway light. For a moment, fear gripped her until he stepped closer, and she saw his face, concerned, exhausted, but somehow reassuring. "You're awake," he said, his voice deep and steady. "I'll get the nurse." "Wait," Lillian called, her voice cracking. "Who are you?" He paused, one hand on the doorframe. "Damon Reeves. I found your car in Miller's Creek." The memory crystallized. The hydroplaning, the terrifying moment when water began seeping into her vehicle. "You pulled me out?" He nodded, a simple acknowledgement without pride or expectation. "Thank you," she whispered, the words wholly inadequate for what he'd done. The nurse arrived, checking Lillian's vitals and asking routine questions, while Damon retreated to the corner of the room. After ensuring Lillian was stable, the nurse left, promising the doctor would arrive soon. "You stayed," Lillian said, studying Damon more carefully now. His clothes were still damp, mud caking his boots. A bandage wrapped around his forearm showed spots of blood. "Wanted to make sure you were okay." He shrugged as if spending the night in a hospital waiting room for a stranger was perfectly normal. "You're hurt," she said, gesturing to his arm. "It's nothing. Scratch from the window glass." An awkward silence fell between them until Lillian broke it. "I don't even know how to begin to thank you." "No need." His eyes met hers directly. Anyone would have done the same. But Lillian knew better. In her world, people rarely did anything without calculating the potential return. "I'd like to compensate you, at least for the damage to your clothes or your time." "No." The word came out firmly, almost defensively. "I don't want anything." His immediate rejection of compensation intrigued her. Most men, upon discovering who she was, quickly found ways to benefit from the connection. But this man seemed genuinely uncomfortable with the mere suggestion. "I'm Lily," she said suddenly, the diminutive of her name slipping out before she'd fully formed the thought. In that split second, a decision crystallized, a chance to be someone other than Lillian Porter, heiress and prize. "Lily," he repeated, nodding. "What brings you out to these back roads in a storm?" "Just needed to get away," she answered truthfully. "I teach 3rd grade in the city." The lie came easily, surprising her. "Thought I'd drive up to the lake for the weekend." Damon nodded, accepting her story without question. "You picked a bad night for it." The doctor entered then, clipboard in hand, interrupting their conversation. After examining Lillian, he delivered his assessment. Mild concussion, bruised ribs, and slight hypothermia, but nothing life-threatening. However, he recommended she stay locally for at least a few days before attempting the drive back to the city. "Do you have somewhere to stay nearby?" the doctor asked. Lillian hesitated. Her family's lake house was less than 20 miles away, but revealing that would risk exposing her identity. "No," she admitted, "but I can find a hotel." "With the storm damage, you'll be hard-pressed to find a vacancy," Damon said. The festival was already filling them up, and now emergency crews and displaced families will take whatever's left. The doctor nodded in agreement. "It's been chaos in the ER all night." Damon shifted his weight, seeming to wrestle with something. "I have a spare room," he finally offered, the words coming reluctantly. "It's nothing fancy, but it's clean, and you'd have privacy." Lillian stared at him, searching for ulterior motives in his expression, but finding only genuine, if uncomfortable, concern. "I couldn't impose," she said automatically, though something inside her yearned to accept. "It's no imposition. Seems wrong to pull someone from a creek just to leave them stranded." A hint of a smile softened his serious face. Lillian considered her options. The sensible choice would be to reveal her identity, call her driver, and retreat to the comfort of her family's lake house. Instead, she found herself saying, "If you're sure it's not too much trouble, I accept." "Thank you." The decision felt both reckless and exhilarating. A chance to experience life without the Porter name opening doors and coloring every interaction. For a few days, she could be just Lily, a schoolteacher recovering from an accident, beholden to the kindness of a stranger who wanted nothing from her. Next morning, Lillian woke to sunlight filtering through unfamiliar curtains. For a moment, disorientation gripped her as she took in the modest room with its simple furnishings, a far cry from her penthouse or the family estate. The events of the previous night rushed back. The accident, the hospital, and her impulsive decision to become Lily for a while. She winced as she sat up, her bruised ribs protesting. A glass of water and 2 pain pills sat on the bedside table, alongside a handwritten note. "Take these if needed. Coffee in kitchen. D." The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched her. In her experience, such consideration usually came with expectations attached. After freshening up in the small but clean bathroom across the hall, Lillian made her way to the kitchen. Through the window, she could see Damon in the adjacent garage, bent over the engine of an old pickup truck. His movements were precise and confident, his focus complete. The kitchen, like the rest of the house, was modest but well maintained. No granite countertops or designer appliances, but everything was functional and organized. She found the coffee and poured herself a cup, savoring its rich aroma. When Damon entered through the side door 20 minutes later, he seemed surprised to find her up and about. "Should you be on your feet?" he asked, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "I'm sore, but sitting around won't help," she replied. "Thank you for the pain medication." He nodded, pouring himself coffee. "There's not much in the fridge. I usually grab something quick between jobs." "I can help with groceries," Lillian offered. "It's the least I can do." "We'll figure something out," he said, clearly uncomfortable with the offer. "I need to get back to work, but make yourself at home." Throughout the day, Lillian observed Damon through the kitchen window. 3 times customers arrived with vehicles in various states of distress. Each time, Damon listened patiently, inspected the problem, and gave what appeared to be honest assessments. When a well-dressed man in an expensive SUV grew agitated at Damon's timeline, she couldn't help but move closer to the window. "Look, I'll pay double if you can finish it today," the man insisted. "Just do whatever it takes." "The problem's with your braking system," Damon replied evenly. "I won't put you and your family back on the road with a quick fix that could fail. 3 days is what it takes to do it right." "This is ridiculous. Jenkins over in Fairview said he could do it in an afternoon." "Then I'd suggest you take it to Jenkins." Damon turned back to his workbench, effectively ending the conversation. The man eventually left, grumbling about small-town mechanics, while Damon returned to his work without visible regret, despite the substantial payment he'd just turned away. That evening, they shared a simple meal of pasta that Lillian prepared from the sparse ingredients in his pantry. "You turned down good money today," she observed. Damon shrugged. "Not worth risking someone's safety." "That's rare," she said, thinking of the countless business people she knew who regularly compromised quality for profit. "Not rare enough," he replied. "My parents died when their car's braking system failed. Turned out the mechanic had taken shortcuts on the repair the week before." The revelation hung in the air between them. "I'm so sorry," Lillian said softly. "It was a long time ago." He cleared his throat. "But it's why I do things a certain way." Over the next few days, a rhythm developed. Lillian's body healed as she helped around the house and observed Damon's dedication to his craft. Their conversations flowed easily, touching on books, current events, and personal philosophies. She found herself sharing thoughts she rarely voiced, minus the details that would reveal her true identity. On the 4th day, while Damon was occupied with a difficult repair, Lillian's curiosity led her to a door at the back of the garage she hadn't noticed before. Inside, she discovered not storage as expected, but a workshop filled with diagrams, prototype models, and a partially assembled device unlike anything she'd seen before. "What are you doing in here?" Damon's voice startled her. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "The door was unlocked, and I was just—" "It's private," he interrupted, his expression guarded. "Is this a safety system?" she asked, gesturing toward the largest prototype. Surprise replaced his wariness. "How did you know that?" "The configuration suggests it's designed to deploy before impact," she said, examining the device more closely. "It's brilliant, actually." Damon's defensiveness slowly melted as Lillian asked insightful questions about his invention, a pre-collision detection and response system that could significantly reduce injuries in accidents. "Where did you learn about engineering?" he asked. "I read a lot," she replied evasively, "and I've taken some business courses. Have you tried approaching manufacturers with this?" 3 so far. They all said the same thing: too expensive to implement, not enough consumer demand. Frustration edged his voice. "I've put everything into developing these prototypes." "Your approach is wrong," Lillian said, drawing on years of business strategy meetings. "You're pitching the technology, but you should be selling the story. How it saves lives, prevents tragedies like what happened to your parents." As the evening progressed, they hunched over his designs together. Lillian offering marketing suggestions while Damon explained technical details. Their hands occasionally brushed, sending unexpected warmth through Lillian's body. She found herself drawn not just to his integrity and intelligence, but to the passion that animated his features when he spoke about his work. When their eyes met over a particularly promising modification she'd suggested, the air between them changed, charged with something neither had anticipated. For the first time in years, Lillian felt truly seen, not as an heiress or a prize, but as a mind and a person worth knowing. The next morning, Lillian woke to the sound of ringing phones. Wrapping herself in a borrowed robe, she made her way to the kitchen where Damon was attempting to pour coffee while balancing a cell phone between his ear and shoulder. "Yes, Mrs. Hargrove, your car will be ready by—" He fumbled with the coffee pot, nearly spilling it. Lillian stepped forward, taking it from his hands. He shot her a grateful look. "By Thursday afternoon. I'll call when it's done." After he hung up, Lillian handed him a filled mug. "You need help around here." "I can't afford help," he said simply, taking a sip. "I could answer phones while I'm recovering. It's the least I can do for your hospitality." Damon hesitated. "You don't have to." "I want to," she insisted. "Besides, I'm going stir-crazy just sitting around." By afternoon, Lillian had transformed the cluttered office. She organized scattered invoices, created a filing system, and set up a scheduling calendar. When the phone rang, she answered with a professional tone that surprised even herself. "Reeves Automotive, how can I help you?" After handling several calls, she discovered a stack of official-looking letters pushed to the back of a drawer. Each bore the seal of the Riverdale County Commissioner's Office, and each contained increasingly stern language about building code violations, tax reassessments, and permit requirements. When Damon returned from a repair job, she held up the letters. "What are these about?" His expression darkened. "Commissioner Blackwell's latest tactics." "For what?" "He wants this property. The location's perfect for the commercial development he's planning." Damon wiped his hands on a rag. "I've turned down his offers, so now he's finding violations to make my life difficult." "That's harassment," Lillian said, indignation rising in her chest. "That's politics in a small town." He shrugged, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. Just another day dealing with Blackwell. Over the next few days, Lillian became a fixture in the garage. Customers responded well to her efficient scheduling and friendly manner. In quiet moments, she found herself watching Damon work, admiring the confidence in his movements and the focus in his expression. One evening, after closing, Damon found her studying the engine of a sedan he'd been repairing. "Interested in how it works?" he asked. "Actually, yes. I've never known what's under the hood of my own car." He smiled. "Every car owner should know the basics. Come on." He led her to a workbench and brought over various components, explaining each one's function. When they moved to a vehicle, he stood behind her, reaching around to guide her hands to the right parts. Lillian felt his chest against her back, his breath warm on her neck as he spoke. "This is the oil dipstick," he said, his voice lower than before. "You pull it out, wipe it clean, then reinsert it to check the level." Lillian was barely listening, acutely aware of his proximity. When she turned her head slightly, their faces were inches apart. His eyes dropped to her lips, and she felt herself leaning toward him. The shrill ring of her cell phone shattered the moment. Pulling away reluctantly, she checked the screen and felt her stomach drop. "Harrison." "I need to take this," she murmured, stepping outside. "Lillian, where the hell have you been?" Her brother's voice was sharp with concern. "Your assistant said you were taking personal time, but it's been over a week with barely a word." "I'm fine, Harrison. I just needed space." "At the lake house?" "Because I called there, and you're clearly not there." She scrambled for an explanation. "I'm staying with a friend, getting some perspective." "What friend? This isn't like you." I'm a grown woman, Harrison. I don't need to report my whereabouts. She softened her tone. I promise I'm safe. I'll be in touch soon. When she returned inside, the moment with Damon had passed. He was back to work, his manner professional once more. The next afternoon, a black luxury SUV pulled up outside the garage. Commissioner Blackwell stepped out, his expensive suit at odds with the working-class surroundings. Lillian was alone in the office when he entered. "Well, hello there," he said, his practiced smile not reaching his eyes. "You must be new." "Just helping out temporarily," she replied, immediately disliking his calculating gaze. "I don't believe we've met. Commissioner Roland Blackwell." He extended his hand, then paused, his attention caught by the watch on her wrist, a limited edition timepiece worth more than most cars in the garage. "Interesting choice of accessory for garage work," he commented, his eyes narrowing slightly. Before she could respond, Damon emerged from under a car. "Blackwell, what do you want?" "Just delivering your new property tax assessment personally." He handed over an envelope. "Seems the county's reevaluated the commercial potential of this location." Damon's jaw tightened as he scanned the document. "This is triple last year's assessment." "Progress comes at a price," Blackwell said smoothly, his gaze drifting back to Lillian. "My offer to purchase still stands. In fact, I might even increase it, given certain changing circumstances." "The answer's still no." Blackwell shrugged. "Think about it, Reeves. Things are only going to get more difficult." His eyes lingered on Lillian's watch once more before he left. "He's going to be trouble," Damon said quietly after the commissioner drove away. Lillian touched her watch unconsciously, suddenly aware of her mistake. "I think he recognized my watch. Why would that matter?" She hesitated, guilt washing over her. "It's expensive. More expensive than a teacher should have." Damon looked at her curiously, but didn't press further, leaving Lillian to wonder how long she could maintain her deception, and what would happen when the truth inevitably came to light. One crisp morning, Commissioner Blackwell sat in his office, staring at the laptop screen with a satisfied smile. The search results confirmed his suspicions about the mysterious woman at Reeves's garage. The society page photo showed her at a charity gala. Lillian Porter, heiress to the Porter real estate empire, whose family controlled billions in development projects across the region. "Well, well," he murmured, leaning back in his leather chair. "What's a Porter doing playing mechanic's assistant in my town?" 3 days later, Lillian was organizing invoices when Blackwell's SUV pulled up outside. Her stomach tightened as he strode through the door. "Ms. Porter," he said quietly, ensuring Damon couldn't hear from the bay where he was working. "I wonder if we might have a word in private." The blood drained from her face. "I don't know who you're talking about." Blackwell's smile was predatory. "Please, the watch was my first clue, but once I looked closer, you're quite recognizable, especially to someone who follows business news." He glanced toward Damon, though apparently not to everyone. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Just a brief conversation. Outside, perhaps." Once they were beside his vehicle, Blackwell's friendly facade dropped. "Your family's Westlake development project comes before the Regional Planning Commission next month. How do you know about that?" "I make it my business to know everything that might affect my interests. That project needs several key approvals I have significant influence over." Lillian crossed her arms. "Get to the point. Simple. Ensure the project includes the parcels I own adjacent to the main site, at my asking price, of course. In return, your little charade here remains our secret." "That's blackmail. I prefer to think of it as mutually beneficial negotiation." His eyes hardened. "You have until the end of the week to convince your family." Otherwise, I wonder how your mechanic friend will feel learning he's been harboring Lillian Porter, whose family is notorious for buying up properties like his and replacing them with luxury developments. After he left, Lillian felt physically ill. The project Blackwell mentioned was real, a mixed-use development Harrison had been working on for months. The commissioner's demands would add millions to the cost while lining his pockets. For the next 2 days, she avoided Damon as much as possible, making excuses to stay in the office or claiming headaches to retire early to her room. Each time he approached, the weight of her deception became heavier. Damon noticed the change. Her sudden distance after their near kiss in the garage left him confused and hurt. Had he misread the signals? Was she regretting getting so close to him? On the third morning, Lillian was reaching for a file on a high shelf when she lost her balance. The ladder wobbled, sending her tumbling backward with a startled cry. Strong arms caught her before she hit the ground. Damon's face was inches from hers, his expression a mixture of concern and something deeper. "Are you okay?" he asked, still holding her. "Yes," she whispered, painfully aware of his proximity. "Damon, The words caught in her throat. She wanted desperately to tell him everything, about Blackwell, about who she really was. The moment stretched between them, taut with unspoken truths. Instead of words, she found herself leaning forward, closing the distance between them. Their lips met, tentative at first, then with growing certainty. His hand moved to cradle her face, gentle despite the calluses on his fingers. When they finally pulled apart, Damon's eyes searched hers. "I thought you were avoiding me." "It's complicated," she admitted, "but this isn't." That evening, they sat on his small back porch, watching fireflies emerge in the gathering dusk. The kiss had changed something between them, creating both intimacy and the painful knowledge that her secret loomed larger than ever. "I never told you why I developed those safety systems," Damon said, breaking a comfortable silence. "I assumed it was for your business." He shook his head, looking out at the darkening yard. "My parents died in a car accident when I was 19. The other driver ran a red light, hit them on the driver's side. The impact protection failed." His voice grew tight. "The investigators said better side impact systems could have saved them." Lillian reached for his hand. "That's why you're so passionate about your designs. Every life saved matters." He squeezed her fingers. "After they died, I promised myself I'd create something that would prevent others from experiencing that kind of loss. It's not just business for me. It never has been." Lillian felt tears pricking her eyes, both moved by his revelation and ashamed of her deception. The man before her had shared his deepest pain and motivation, while she continued living a lie that grew more dangerous by the day. As Damon pulled her closer, Lillian rested her head against his shoulder, the warmth of their connection contrasting sharply with the cold reality of Blackwell's threat hanging over them. Next day, the sleek black luxury sedan looked absurdly out of place parked beside Damon's weathered pickup truck. Lillian spotted it immediately as she stepped outside the garage office with a stack of invoices in hand. Her heart sank when the driver's door opened and her brother emerged, his tall frame unfolding as he straightened his designer suit. Harrison Porter's eyes locked onto his sister with laser focus. "Lily!" he called, using her nickname with pointed emphasis. "What a surprise finding you here." Damon appeared from beneath a raised hood, wiping his hands on a rag. "Can I help you?" Harrison's practiced smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm Harrison, Lily's brother." He extended a hand that Damon hesitantly shook. "I've been trying to reach her for days." "My phone was damaged in the accident," Lillian interjected quickly. "I mentioned that, remember?" "Did you mention you'd be staying with a—" Harrison glanced around the garage with barely concealed disdain. "Mechanic?" Damon's posture stiffened. Lily needed somewhere to recover. The hospital couldn't keep her. How fortunate she found such a good Samaritan. Harrison's tone made the word sound like an accusation. Lillian stepped between them. Damon saved my life. He's been nothing but respectful and kind. I'm sure, Harrison replied coolly. Lily, we need to talk. Family matter. Damon nodded. Use the office. I'll finish up Mr. Peterson's timing belt. Once the door closed behind them, Harrison rounded on her. Have you lost your mind, Lillian? The entire family is worried sick. I had to track your phone to find you. Lower your voice, she hissed. And it's Lily here. This little experiment of yours needs to end now. I'm taking you home. Lillian crossed her arms. I'm 32 years old, Harrison. I decide where I go and when. Living with some small-town mechanic? What exactly is going on between you two? She felt heat rise to her cheeks. That's none of your business. Harrison's eyes widened. My God, you're sleeping with him. I'm not, she began, then stopped herself. What if I am? Damon is honest, hardworking, brilliant actually. He has patents pending on safety systems that could revolutionize. Does he know who you are? What you're worth? Lillian's silence was answer enough. Harrison pinched the bridge of his nose. So, he thinks you're what? Some school teacher? This is a disaster waiting to happen. It's not like that. I just wanted someone to see me, not the Porter fortune. And when he discovers you've been lying? The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Lillian sank into a chair. I'm going to tell him. I just need to find the right moment. There is no right moment to reveal you've been living a lie. I haven't been lying about who I am, she insisted. Just my circumstances. Harrison studied his sister's face. You've fallen for him. It wasn't a question, but Lillian nodded anyway. Please, Harrison, give me time to handle this my way. After a long moment, he sighed. 3 days, Lillian. Then either you tell him or I will. When they emerged, Damon was hanging up the office phone, his expression grim. Everything okay? Lillian asked. Just bank stuff. He forced a smile. Your brother staying for dinner? Harrison checked his watch. Actually, I need to get back. I have a meeting tomorrow morning. He handed Lillian a small package. Your new phone. My number's programmed in. After Harrison departed with a warning glance at his sister, Damon waited until his taillights disappeared before speaking. He doesn't approve of me. He doesn't know you, Lillian countered. What was that about bank stuff? She asked later as they prepared dinner together in Damon's small kitchen. Damon's hands stilled over the cutting board. My loan application was rejected. Again. Third bank this month. But your business is viable. Your designs have potential. Doesn't matter. On paper, I'm a risk. He resumed chopping vegetables with more force than necessary. Blackwell's probably behind it. He wants this property, and he's making sure I can't stay afloat. Lillian fought the urge to tell him she could solve his financial problems with a single phone call. Instead, she moved behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her cheek against his back. You'll find a way. That night, over a simple meal of pasta and wine by candlelight, something shifted between them. Their conversation flowed effortlessly from books to dreams to childhood memories. Lillian carefully editing hers to maintain her cover. When Damon reached across the table to brush a strand of hair from her face, his touch lingered. I never expected to find someone like you here. Neither did I, she whispered, the truth of the statement piercing through her guilt. Later, as moonlight filtered through the bedroom curtains, Lillian traced the contours of Damon's face with her fingertips. Their kisses had deepened, clothes had been discarded, and in the intimacy that followed, she'd found a connection that transcended her deception. Now, watching him sleep beside her, Lillian felt both completely herself and utterly fraudulent. Harrison's ultimatum echoed in her mind. 3 days to tell Damon the truth, or risk losing everything they'd built together. The morning after their night together, Lillian waited until Damon left for a parts run before making the call. Her brother answered on the first ring. "I need a favor," she said, pacing the small kitchen. "A business favor." Harrison sighed. "What kind of trouble are you in now?" "None, but Damon is. His garage is facing foreclosure, and he can't get funding for his safety innovations. And you want the Porter fortune to bail him out?" "Not exactly." Lillian leaned against the counter. "I need you to create a shell company. Make it look like an angel investor interested in automotive safety technology." "Lillian, I'm going to tell him everything, Harrison. I promise. But I can't let him lose everything he's worked for when I could help." After a moment's hesitation, Harrison agreed. "Send me his business plan and patent applications. I'll have legal set it up today." 2 days later, Damon stared at the letter in disbelief. "This can't be real." "What is it?" Lillian asked, feigning ignorance while her heart raced. "An investment offer." He handed her the document. "Some company called Safe Haven Ventures wants to fund my safety systems. Full development, manufacturing connections, everything." Lillian scanned the letter she'd helped craft. "That's amazing. They must have seen your prototypes somewhere." "But nobody's seen them except..." His eyes widened. "Did you do something?" She swallowed hard. "I might have taken some photos and sent them to a few contacts from my teaching network. Someone must have passed them along." Damon lifted her off her feet in a spinning hug. "You're incredible. This changes everything." "You deserve it," she said, guilt mingling with genuine happiness at seeing his joy. The next evening, Damon organized an impromptu celebration at Ruby's Diner. He invited local friends, suppliers, and even a few loyal customers who'd stuck with him through difficult times. Lillian helped arrange everything, knowing this might be her last happy moment with him before the truth came out. The diner buzzed with conversation and laughter. Damon moved through the crowd, his hand rarely leaving the small of Lillian's back, pride evident in his eyes whenever he introduced her. "Never seen him this happy," Ruby commented, sliding a milkshake toward Lillian. "You're good for him." "He's good for me too," Lillian replied softly. When Damon clinked his glass for attention, the room quieted. "I wanted to thank everyone who supported this crazy dream of mine, especially when things looked impossible." His gaze found Lillian's across the room, and the warmth in his eyes made her chest tighten. "Most of all, I want to thank Lily." He extended his hand, drawing her to his side. When everyone else saw a struggling mechanic, she saw something more. She believed in me when I'd almost stopped believing in myself. Lillian blinked back tears as scattered applause filled the diner. Damon's arm tightened around her waist, and for a moment, she allowed herself to imagine a future where her deception didn't stand between them. The diner's bell jingled as the door opened. Commissioner Blackwell strode in, flanked by 2 associates, his calculated smile freezing the celebration. "Quite a gathering," he observed, eyes scanning the room before landing on Damon. "Celebrating your mysterious investor?" Damon stiffened beside her. "What do you want, Blackwell?" "Just offering congratulations." The commissioner's gaze shifted to Lillian, malice glinting in his eyes. "Although I wonder if your guests know exactly who they're celebrating with." Lillian felt the blood drain from her face. "What are you talking about?" Damon asked. Blackwell reached into his jacket, extracting a folded newspaper. He opened it to reveal a society page with Lillian's photograph at a charity gala. "Allow me to introduce Lillian Porter, heiress to the Porter real estate empire." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "Worth millions," Blackwell continued, his voice carrying through the stunned silence. "And I suspect, the mysterious angel investor behind Safe Haven Ventures." Damon turned to her, confusion giving way to dawning comprehension. Lily? Damon, I can explain, she whispered. Explain what? His voice was unnervingly quiet. That you've been lying since the moment we met? Not about everything. Did you set up that investment company? She couldn't lie anymore. Yes, but... So this was what? Charity? A rich girl's project? The hurt in his eyes was worse than anger would have been. It was profound disappointment, as if something precious had been irrevocably damaged. No, Lillian insisted. What's between us is real. Blackwell's satisfied chuckle broke the tension. I'll leave you to your celebration. As he departed, the diner remained frozen in awkward silence. Damon stepped away from Lillian, the physical distance between them mirroring the emotional chasm that had just opened. Damon, please. She reached for his hand. He pulled away. I think you should go. The diner emptied quickly after Blackwell's dramatic exit, leaving only Lillian and Damon in painful silence. She tried to reach for him again, but he stepped back, arms crossed over his chest like a barrier. I need you to leave, Damon said, his voice hollow. Please, just let me explain everything, Lillian pleaded, tears streaming down her face. Was any of it real? His question hung in the air between them. Or was I just some project? Poor mechanic needs saving. That's not fair, she whispered. What we have is real. What we had, he corrected, was built on lies. Not the important parts, Lillian insisted. My feelings for you are real. The person you got to know, that's the real me, Damon. The name and background were different, but my heart was honest. He shook his head, unable to meet her eyes. I need space. I can't even look at you right now without wondering what else isn't true. The finality in his voice broke something inside her. Lillian nodded, gathered her purse, and walked out of the diner alone. 3 days later, Lillian sat on the dock of her family's lake house, staring blankly at the water. She'd barely eaten, barely slept. Her phone lay beside her, silent. No calls from Damon. The crunch of footsteps on gravel announced Harrison's arrival. He sat beside her without speaking, his suit jacket folded neatly beside him. You look terrible, he finally said. Thanks, Lillian replied without emotion. This isn't like you, Lil. You're stronger than this. She turned to him, eyes rimmed red. I've lost him, Harrison. And the worst part is, he's right to push me away. I lied to him from the beginning. So that's it? The great Lillian Porter gives up. Harrison's voice hardened. The sister I know would fight for what matters. He doesn't want to see me. And when has that ever stopped you? Harrison stood, brushing off his pants. You found something real with him. I saw it. Even I had to admit it. So are you going to let Blackwell win, or are you going to do something about it? His words pierced through her fog of misery. For the first time in days, Lillian felt a spark of determination. Damon moved mechanically through his garage, going through the motions of work without feeling. The investment offer from Safe Haven Ventures sat untouched on his desk. He couldn't bring himself to sign it, even though refusing meant losing everything. You're an idiot, Ruby announced, letting herself into his office. Not in the mood, Ruby. Too bad. She perched on his desk. You're throwing away the best thing that ever happened to you. She lied about everything. Did she? Did she lie about caring for you? About believing in your work? Ruby shook her head. You know who exposed her, right? Blackwell. The same man who's been trying to ruin you for years. Damon paused, the wrench in his hand suddenly heavy. Why would he do that? He asked slowly. Think about it. What does Blackwell want more than anything? My land. And who has the resources to stop him from taking it? Ruby raised her eyebrows meaningfully. Damon set down his tools, a new perspective taking shape. Later that evening, he drove past the construction site where Blackwell was developing his latest project. Two men in suits were exchanging envelopes in the shadows. One was Blackwell. The other, Damon recognized as the bank manager who had denied his loan. Lillian sat surrounded by documents in her home office. Harrison had helped her gather information on Blackwell's activities over the years. Suspicious property acquisitions, zoning changes that benefited only his projects, businesses forced to close through selective code enforcement. "Look at this," Harrison pointed to a property record. This was Mrs. Henley's bakery. Blackwell cited health violations until she was forced to sell at a quarter of its value. And then miraculously, the violations disappeared when he flipped it, Lillian added. "We need more than patterns, though. We need proof." Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Check your email. Thought you might find this useful. Ruby." The attached files contained photos of Blackwell with the bank manager, clearly exchanging money, along with screenshots of emails discussing handling Damon's loan application. Lillian's heart raced. This is it. This is how we stop him. As she compiled the evidence, Lillian felt purpose returning. She might have lost Damon, but she could still fight for what was right. And maybe, just maybe, prove that her feelings had been real all along. Lillian's hands trembled slightly as she sealed the manila envelope. Inside lay meticulously organized documents detailing Commissioner Blackwell's plans to fabricate safety violations against Damon's garage. She'd spent 3 sleepless nights compiling everything: property records, testimonies from former building inspectors who'd left the department rather than participate in Blackwell's schemes, and most damning of all, internal emails discussing the Reeves problem and how to expedite condemnation procedures. She addressed the envelope without a return address, then drove to a post office 2 towns over to mail it. The anonymity felt wrong after all the lies, but she feared Damon would discard anything bearing her name without opening it. "This isn't about me anymore," she whispered to herself as she dropped the envelope into the mail slot. "It's about doing what's right." 3 days later, Damon watched from his office window as 2 county inspectors in crisp uniforms approached his garage. He'd been expecting them since receiving the anonymous package. Rather than panic, he felt a strange calm. For once, he had the upper hand. "Gentlemen," he greeted them, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "What brings the county to my humble establishment today?" The taller inspector cleared his throat. "Routine safety inspection, Mr. Reeves. We've received reports of potential code violations." "Interesting timing," Damon replied evenly. "Well, you're welcome to look around. I've prepared some documentation you might find relevant." He led them to a table where he'd laid out copies of his building permits, recent private safety certifications, and, most importantly, printouts of the very inspection forms they were carrying, complete with violations already filled in. The inspectors exchanged uncomfortable glances. "Where did you get these?" the shorter one asked. "Let's just say someone doesn't appreciate being used as a pawn in Commissioner Blackwell's real estate games," Damon replied. "I understand you gentlemen have jobs to do, but I think we all know what's really happening here." By the time they left 2 hours later, the inspectors had filed a clean report and suggested Damon might want to attend the upcoming county board meeting. "There's going to be a special hearing about certain development practices," the taller inspector said quietly as they departed. "Your preparation today was impressive. The board would benefit from hearing your perspective." After they left, Damon stared at the anonymous envelope on his desk. Only one person could have sent him this information. Only one person had both the resources to obtain it and the motivation to help him. Lillian. Lillian's phone rang as she sat reviewing more evidence against Blackwell. When she saw Damon's name on the screen, her heart nearly stopped. "Hello?" she answered, her voice barely above a whisper. "The inspectors came today," Damon said without preamble. "Funny thing, I was completely prepared for them." Silence stretched between them. "Thank you," he finally said. for the warning." "It was the least I could do," she replied carefully. "Blackwell needs to be stopped." "I agree." Another pause. "The county board is holding a special hearing. I could use your help preparing for it." "Of course," Lillian said, hope flickering in her chest. "Whatever you need." "I'm still angry," Damon added, his voice tight. "I don't know if I can trust you again." "I understand," she said, swallowing the pain his words caused. "I'm truly sorry, Damon. For everything. I never meant to hurt you." "I know." His voice softened slightly. "Ruby's Diner, tomorrow at noon. We can talk about strategy." "I'll be there." The booth at Ruby's felt smaller than Lillian remembered. She sat across from Damon, hyper-aware of the distance between them, both physical and emotional. They had spread documents across the table, speaking in professional tones about evidence and testimonies. "I've contacted other business owners Blackwell has targeted," Lillian explained, sliding a list toward him. 3 have agreed to testify about similar experiences." "That's good," Damon nodded. "The more patterns we can establish, the better." Their fingers brushed as they both reached for the same document. The brief contact sent electricity through Lillian's arm, and she quickly pulled back. "Sorry," she murmured. Damon's eyes met hers for a moment before returning to the papers. "Mrs. Henderson from the bakery. She's willing to speak?" "Yes. She lost everything because of him." As they worked, the awkwardness gradually eased. When Ruby brought their lunch, she raised an eyebrow at their businesslike demeanor, but said nothing. By the time they finished their meal, they had fallen into their old rhythm of finishing each other's thoughts and building on each other's ideas. For brief moments, Lillian could almost forget the chasm between them. "We make a good team," Damon said as they gathered the documents. The statement hung in the air, loaded with unspoken meaning. "We do," Lillian agreed softly. As they walked to their cars, Damon stopped suddenly. "I'm not ready to forgive everything," he said, "but I'm glad we're doing this together." Lillian nodded, blinking back tears. "Me too." It wasn't reconciliation, not yet, but it was a beginning. The county hearing room buzzed with tension as residents packed the wooden benches. Commissioner Blackwell sat at the front table, immaculately dressed in an expensive suit that seemed to announce his confidence. He leaned back in his chair, exchanging pleasant nods with board members as though the outcome were already decided. Damon sat rigidly in the first row, his face set in determination. When Blackwell presented his case for condemning the garage property, citing fabricated safety concerns and development necessities, Damon clenched his jaw but remained composed. "The board will now hear objections," the chairwoman announced. Damon rose, folder in hand. "I have documentation proving these allegations are false and—" The back doors swung open. Heads turned as Lillian strode down the center aisle, followed by Harrison and 3 people carrying boxes of documents. She wore a tailored suit that marked her return to her public identity as Lillian Porter, but her eyes held the same determination he'd seen in Lily when they'd worked side by side in his garage. "Madam Chairwoman," Lillian announced, "I have evidence that Commissioner Blackwell has engaged in systematic corruption and extortion against multiple business owners in this county." Blackwell's smug expression faltered. "This is preposterous. Ms. Porter has a personal vendetta." "Let's hear the evidence," the chairwoman interrupted. For the next hour, business owners rose one by one. Mrs. Henderson from the bakery described how Blackwell had fabricated health violations until she sold her prime location to his brother-in-law at half its value. The hardware store owner testified about mysterious tax audits that disappeared when he agreed to support Blackwell's candidates. Blackwell's face grew increasingly pale. When Lillian played recorded conversations of him explicitly demanding bribes from developers, The room erupted in outrage. "These recordings were obtained legally through whistleblowers in your office," Lillian explained calmly. "I've provided copies to the district attorney." As if on cue, 2 officers entered the room. When the chairwoman called for an emergency vote to remove Blackwell from office pending criminal investigation, it passed unanimously. The officers approached, and Blackwell was escorted out, his face contorted with rage. In the chaotic aftermath, Damon found Lillian in the hallway. "Thank you," he said simply. "You didn't have to do all this." "Yes, I did," she replied. "It was the right thing to do." Something flickered in his eyes. Respect, perhaps even admiration, but the warmth they once shared remained absent. "I'm heading back to the city next week," Lillian said, watching his face carefully. "My family's company needs attention, and I've been away too long." Damon nodded, his expression unreadable. He didn't ask her to stay. "I've set up an investment fund for your safety innovations," she continued. "The paperwork gives you complete control. No strings attached. It's not charity, Damon. It's because I believe in what you're creating." "I appreciate that," he said formally. Lillian swallowed hard against the lump in her throat. "I meant everything I said when I was here. Who I was with you. That was the real me, even if my name wasn't." Damon's eyes softened slightly, but he only nodded. "Take care of yourself, Lillian." She watched him walk away, her public victory hollow against the private loss of what might have been. Days have passed. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Damon's workshop as he sat alone at his workbench. In his hands, he turned over the safety device prototype, the one Lillian had helped him refine with her surprisingly insightful suggestions. His thumb traced the modification they'd sketched together during those long evenings when the line between work and something more intimate had blurred. Outside, he heard the moving truck pull up to collect the few boxes Lillian had accumulated during her stay. She was leaving. Today. "You're being an idiot," he muttered to himself. The realization hit him with physical force. He was letting his wounded pride cost him the woman he loved. Yes, she had lied about her name, her background, but hadn't he seen the real person beneath those details? The woman who stayed up late helping him solve engineering problems, who faced down corruption without flinching, who looked at him like he mattered not for what he could give her, but for who he was. Damon yanked open his desk drawer and pulled out a small velvet box that had remained untouched for years. His grandmother's ring, simple, elegant, with a modest diamond that caught the light as he opened the lid. "Damn it all," he said, pocketing the ring and grabbing his keys. He drove recklessly fast to the lake house, tires kicking up gravel as he skidded to a stop in the circular driveway. Lillian's sleek car was packed and ready to go. He bounded up the steps and pounded on the door. When Lillian opened it, her eyes widened in surprise. "Damon?" "I'm an idiot," he blurted out, still breathless from his rush. "A stubborn, proud idiot." She stood frozen in the doorway, surrounded by half-packed boxes. "What are you doing here?" "Stopping you from leaving, or at least asking you not to." Damon stepped forward, his heart hammering. "I didn't fall in love with your money or your last name. I fell in love with the woman who color-coded my filing system and argued with me about carburetor designs and laughed at my terrible jokes." Lillian's eyes filled with tears. "But I lied to you. What hurt wasn't finding out you were wealthy," Damon said, taking her hand. "It was thinking that maybe none of it was real, that I was just some project or experiment in how the other half lives." "No," she whispered fiercely. "Being Lily with you was the most real I've ever been. With you, I wasn't an heiress or a porter. I was just me." Damon pulled out the ring box and opened it. "This was my grandmother's. It's not fancy or expensive, but—" "It's perfect," Lillian interrupted, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I love you," he said simply. "The real you, whoever that is, whatever name you use, whatever bank account you have." Lillian stepped into his arms, and their lips met in a kiss that held all the promise of their future, her resources and his innovations combining to create something neither could accomplish alone. When they finally broke apart, both were smiling through tears. "We can make your safety systems a reality," she said. "Together." "I don't care about that right now," Damon replied, holding her close. "I just care about you staying." "Always," Lillian promised, as he slipped the ring onto her finger. If you enjoyed this story, I've found another special one just for you. Our community can't stop talking about how heartwarming and moving it is. Click on the video in front of you to experience this beautiful story before it's gone.